What if I told you that while you're sipping champagne at a charity gala, you overhear your husband and mother-in-law discussing your expiration date, not your death, your replacement with someone more suitable for their family empire? Tonight's story is about Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an FBI forensic accountant who discovered at a Miami charity auction that her 5-year marriage was actually a business arrangement. Her husband, Marcus Whitmore, hadn't just married her for love, he'd married her for her federal credentials to legitimize his family's international trafficking empire. But Marcus made one critical error. He underestimated exactly how dangerous a forensic accountant could be when she decided to investigate her own life. The Hermes clutch trembled in my hand as Marcus's voice drifted through the marble columns of the Bal Harbor Club's auction hall. I'd stepped out onto the oceanfront terrace for air during the intermission, escaping the suffocating blend of champagne breath and designer perfume that marked Miami's charity season. The October breeze carried the salt tang of Biscayne Bay, but it also carried something else, my husband's voice, low and conspiratorial. Elena's forensic skills were useful for cleaning up the Cayman accounts. He was saying to someone in the shadows beyond the palm fronds, but once the Port Miami expansion is approved, we'll need someone with better social connections. I froze crystal champagne flute halfway to my lips. The auction had been in full swing inside another tedious evening of paddle raising for whatever cause Victoria Whitmore had chosen this season. But now, pressed against the cool marble of a supporting column, I felt the familiar analytical coldness that came with sensing financial irregularities. The Vanderbilt girl would be perfect, continued a woman's voice I recognized with sick certainty, my mother-in-law, Victoria Whitmore. Sophia understands our world. She wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about revenue streams. My breath caught. Revenue streams. In 5 years of marriage, Marcus had never discussed Whitmore Development's revenue streams with me beyond the glossy marketing materials. Luxury resorts across the Caribbean, maritime shipping property development, all legitimate businesses that shouldn't require cleaning up. How long? Marcus asked, and I could picture him checking his Patek Philippe, the one I'd helped him select for our 3rd anniversary when I still believed we were building something together. After the Port Authority vote next month, the expansion approval gives us plausible cover for the increased cargo volume. Elena's served her purpose. The FBI credentials opened doors we couldn't access otherwise. But maintaining the marriage becomes a liability once the investigation period ends. Investigation period. FBI credentials. My hand moved instinctively to my federal ID badge hidden in the clutch's silk lining. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Financial Crimes Unit, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The badge that had made Marcus so proud when we met at a white-collar crime symposium 6 years ago. The expertise he'd called fascinating during our courtship. The expertise that had apparently been the reason for our courtship. She trusts you completely. Victoria continued, her voice carrying that particular satisfaction she reserved for successful social manipulations. Cuban girls from Hialeah, they're grateful for the upgrade. They don't ask questions when their new family suddenly needs financial advice. The crystal slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the travertine terrace with a sound like breaking ice. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of loving a man who'd married me for my federal badge and my forensic accounting expertise. 5 years of being grateful for an upgrade I'd never needed. Inside, the auctioneer's gavel resumed its rhythm, but out here in the salt air, I heard something else entirely. The sound of my carefully constructed life cracking along invisible fault lines. I was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, forensic accountant, financial crimes expert, the woman who'd helped bring down 3 major money laundering operations, and I'd apparently been living with the 4th. 20 minutes later, I sat in the Bal Harbor Club's powder room staring at my reflection while my hands shook with more than anger. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger, perfectly blown out dark hair, courtesy of Marcus's preferred salon makeup applied by an artist whose services came with my new social stratum, wearing a Valentino gown that cost more than my parents' monthly rent. But beneath the polished exterior sat Dr. Elena Rodriguez, first-generation Cuban-American daughter of a cafeteria worker, and a mechanic who'd sacrificed everything so their daughter could attend the University of Miami on academic scholarships. The woman who'd earned her PhD in forensic accounting at 28, who joined the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit because she believed in justice and protecting the vulnerable from those who weaponized wealth. The woman who'd apparently been played for a fool by her own husband. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through 5 years of memories with new eyes. Marcus at the white-collar crime symposium where we'd met asking such thoughtful questions about financial investigation techniques. Marcus introducing me to his family, Victoria's smile tight but approving when she learned about my federal credentials. Marcus suggesting we marry quickly. When you know, just 3 months after the FBI had closed its investigation into Caribbean money laundering operations. 3 months after I'd been the lead forensic accountant on that case. The timing hadn't seemed significant then. I'd been swept up in the romance of it all, the Yale-educated heir to a legitimate business empire, choosing the scholarship girl from Hialeah. Marcus had made me feel like Cinderella. And I'd been too intoxicated by love to notice how often he asked about my work, how interested he was in my techniques for tracking offshore transactions. My phone buzzed. A text from my partner at the bureau. Working late on the Petrov case. Those Cayman structures you flagged are more complex than we thought. You free to consult tomorrow. Cayman structures. My blood chilled as I remembered Marcus's casual questions about my current cases. His fascination when I'd mentioned the complexity of modern shell company networks. I'd thought he was just being a supportive husband interested in my work. But Victoria's words echoed. Elena's forensic skills were useful for cleaning up the Cayman accounts. I opened my banking app, something I rarely did since Marcus handled our finances. The joint account showed regular transfers from Whitmore Development, enough to maintain our lifestyle, but modest compared to the family's visible wealth. But now with my forensic eye engaged, I noticed something odd: the wire transfer codes. They weren't from the main Whitmore Development accounts I'd seen on tax documents. They were from subsidiary accounts I'd never heard of. Standing in that marble powder room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth I'd never asked for, I felt the familiar rush that came with detecting financial irregularities. It was a feeling I'd learned to trust, the sense that numbers weren't adding up, that clean surfaces hid dirty money. My marriage had been a cover story. But unlike Marcus's previous victims, he'd chosen to marry a forensic accountant. That was about to be a very expensive mistake. I thought about our Coral Gables home, the Star Island mansion we visited for family dinners, the casual mentions of business trips to the Caymans. I thought about my expertise being used to legitimize criminal enterprises, my federal badge opening doors for money launderers. But mostly, I thought about what Victoria had said about Cuban girls from Hialeah being grateful for upgrades. My parents had immigrated with nothing, built their life through honest work, raised a daughter who believed in justice. They'd sacrificed so I could have opportunities they'd never had. Not so I could be grateful for marrying into money, but so I could stand on my own merit. Marcus had mistaken me for a woman who'd be grateful to be chosen. He had no idea he'd married a woman who'd spent her career choosing to fight back. I returned to the auction, sliding into my seat beside Marcus as if nothing had changed. He smiled, placing his hand on my knee in a gesture I'd once found comforting. Now it felt like ownership. Missed anything interesting? I asked, keeping my voice light. Just the usual paddle wars, he replied, gesturing toward the stage where Victoria was presenting a check to the evening's charity. Mother outdid herself with the turnout. I watched Victoria accept applause, her smile radiant as she discussed the importance of supporting vulnerable children. The irony wasn't lost on me, a woman who profited from human trafficking being celebrated for her charity work. Because that's what this was about, wasn't it? Money laundering operations, this sophisticated, didn't exist in isolation. They supported something larger, something that required the kind of cargo volume increases Marcus had mentioned. Marcus, I said casually, remind me what the Port Miami expansion is for. You mentioned it was important for the shipping business. His hand tightened slightly on my knee. Just increased capacity for legitimate cargo. Tourism equipment for the resort's construction materials. Nothing you'd find interesting. But I did find it interesting. Very interesting. As the evening wound down and we made our social rounds, I cataloged every interaction with new awareness. The way certain men nodded respectfully when Marcus introduced me as an FBI forensic accountant. The slight tension when anyone mentioned federal investigations. The careful way conversations changed when I approached. I'd been living in the heart of a criminal enterprise, my credentials used as camouflage, my expertise exploited to perfect their operations. They'd chosen the wrong woman to underestimate. By the time we reached our car, Marcus's Bentley, purchased with money I now suspected was far from clean. I'd made my decision. I wouldn't confront him tonight. I wouldn't let emotion drive my actions. I was going to do what I did best, follow. The money build a case and bring down every last person involved in this operation. Starting with my husband. The next morning, I sat in my FBI office in downtown Miami, staring at my computer screen while my coffee grew cold. The federal building's sterile fluorescent lighting felt comforting after the opulent staging of last night's auction. Here, surrounded by case files and evidence boards, I could think clearly. I'd arrived early before my partner, Agent David Chen, came in before anyone could question why I was running database searches on my own husband. The first search on Marcus Whitmore yielded exactly what I expected: clean record, no red flags, the kind of unremarkable profile that money and good lawyers could maintain. But forensic accounting had taught me that the most interesting information lived in the spaces between official records. I pulled up the Whitmore Development corporate structure, something I'd glanced at during our marriage for curiosity, but never examined with professional scrutiny. What I saw made my pulse quicken. Whitmore Development Group served as the parent company for 17 subsidiaries. Normal for a business that size, but the geographic distribution raised flag shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the British Virgin Islands. Classic offshore havens that legitimate businesses might use for tax purposes, but that criminals used for far more sinister reasons. I cross-referenced the subsidiary names with my database of known money laundering vehicles. 3 hits. 3 companies that had appeared in previous investigations, always just peripheral enough to avoid scrutiny. My hands moved automatically across the keyboard muscle memory from hundreds of similar investigations taking over. Federal databases opened like flowers to my credentials, bank records, customs declarations, shipping manifests. The same credentials Marcus had found so valuable. The pattern emerged within an hour. Whitmore Maritime. The shipping arm I'd barely paid attention to operated 12 cargo vessels with regular routes between Miami, the Caribbean, and South America. The manifest showed consistent cargo construction materials, resort equipment, luxury goods for the hotel properties. But the tonnage calculations were wrong. I'd seen this before in trafficking cases. Manifests that declared lightweight cargo but showed heavy tonnage, suggesting hidden compartments carrying human cargo or drugs. Ships that made unscheduled stops at coordinates that matched no official ports. My phone buzzed. David Chen entering the building downstairs. I quickly shifted screens to the Petrov case we'd been working a Russian oligarch's art collection that was definitely being used to launder money. But my mind stayed on the Whitmore files. "You're here early," David said, appearing in our shared workspace with his usual large coffee and skeptical expression. 5 years as partners had made us efficient collaborators despite David's perpetual suspicion that white-collar criminals were getting away with too much. "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true. "Kept thinking about those Cayman structures." "The Petrov case. All of them," I replied carefully. "Have you noticed how sophisticated these offshore networks are getting? Like someone's been teaching them better techniques." David settled into his chair, pulling up files on his computer. "Yeah, they're definitely learning from our investigations. Someone's getting insider information about our methods." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Someone was getting insider information. Someone like the forensic accountant married to a money launderer. Over the next several hours, I maintained the pretense of working the Petrov case while systematically investigating my own life. Every break David took, every moment alone, I dug deeper into the Whitmore empire. The financial picture grew clearer and more disturbing. Whitmore Development reported modest profits, exactly what you'd expect from a family business in a competitive market. But the subsidiary companies showed cash flows that defied explanation, massive transfers between accounts with no corresponding business activities. I found the smoking gun in a customs database. Whitmore Maritime's vessel, Caribbean Star, had been inspected 6 months ago at Port Miami. The manifest declared 2,000 tons of construction equipment bound for Barbados. But the inspection notes mentioned discrepancies, sealed containers that couldn't be opened due to hazardous materials documentation, cargo weights that didn't match manifests, and crew members with documentation irregularities. The inspection had been cut short after a call from the Port Authority, a call that referenced federal law enforcement clearance. My federal law enforcement clearance. I felt sick. My credentials hadn't just been used to legitimize financial structures, they'd been used to stop federal inspections of human trafficking operations. "Elena." David's voice cut through my horror. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Just reviewing some old cases, I managed, trying to understand how these networks stay ahead of us. But David wasn't easily fooled. He'd been watching me all morning, and his investigative instincts were as sharp as mine. "What case are you really working on?" he asked quietly, moving his chair closer. "Because you've been in federal databases for 3 hours and none of your searches match the Petrov file." I stared at him, my partner, my friend, the man who'd backed me up in dangerous situations and celebrated my successes. Could I trust him with this? Could I trust anyone? "David," I said slowly. "Hypothetically, if a federal agent discovered their spouse was involved in money laundering, what would be the proper procedure?" His eyes sharpened. Hypothetically. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Hypothetically, that agent would be required to report it immediately. They'd be removed from any related cases and probably suspended pending investigation. And if that agent had unknowingly provided assistance to the criminal enterprise, they'd be looking at conspiracy charges unless they cooperated fully and immediately. I nodded, the full weight of my situation settling over me. I wasn't just married to a criminal, I was an unwitting accomplice. My expertise, my credentials, my federal access had all been weaponized against the very laws I'd sworn to uphold. "Elena," David said gently, "this isn't hypothetical, is it?" Before I could answer, my personal phone rang. Marcus checking in like the caring husband he'd pretended to be for 5 years. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, forcing warmth into my voice while David watched with growing concern. "Just wanted to see how your day was going," Marcus said. "I know you were working on that Russian case, making progress." The same question he'd asked dozens of times, the same interested husband routine. But now I heard it differently, the fishing for information, the subtle pressure to share details about federal investigations. "It's complicated," I said carefully. "These offshore structures are incredibly sophisticated, almost like someone's been teaching them our investigation techniques." "I'm sure you'll figure it out," Marcus replied. "You always do. See you tonight?" "Of course, love you." "Love you too?" I hung up and met David's eyes. He'd heard enough. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Conference room now." As we walked toward the secure conference room, I felt the weight of the decision I was about to make. I could continue pretending, try to protect my marriage, hope that I was wrong about Marcus, or I could do my job. By the time we reached the conference room, I'd made my choice. "Show me everything," David said, closing the conference room door behind us. For the next hour, I walked him through my discoveries, the offshore subsidiaries, the shipping irregularities, the customs inspection that had been terminated using my credentials. David listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Jesus, Elena," he said finally. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the patterns since before we got married, possibly since we first met." David leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "We need to involve the task force immediately. This is beyond just financial crimes. We're looking at human trafficking, possibly drug smuggling, definitely corruption of federal agents." "Wait," I said, my forensic instincts kicking in. "Before we bring in anyone else, I need to check something." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my personal documents app, where I kept digital copies of important paperwork. The prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted on, just family tradition, he'd said appeared on screen. "What are you looking for?" David asked. "Insurance." I replied grimly, scanning the legal language that had seemed so romantic when I'd signed it 5 years ago. Marcus had presented it as protection for both of us, a way to ensure our marriage wasn't complicated by financial pressures. I found what I was looking for in Section 7 confidentiality provisions. "David, look at this." I turned the phone toward him. The prenup includes a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement about all financial matters related to either party's business interests. He read quickly, his frown deepening. "This is unusual. Most prenups focus on asset division, not information sharing." "It gets worse." I scrolled to Section 12. "Look at the enforcement clause. Any violation of the confidentiality provisions results in immediate forfeiture of all marital assets and exposes the violating party to civil liability for damages." David whistled low. They legally gagged you before you even knew there was anything to be gagged about. But I was already moving to the next section, my heart pounding as the full scope of the trap became clear. David, I said quietly, Section 15, Professional Obligations. And he read it aloud. Both parties acknowledge that their professional duties may create conflicts with marital confidentiality. In such cases, the non-professional spouse agrees to recuse themselves from any legal proceedings that might compromise the professional spouse's career or reputation. What does that mean in plain English? I set down the phone, the legal trap now crystal clear. It means that if I report Marcus for financial crimes, I'm violating the prenup's confidentiality clause. But if I don't report him, I'm violating my federal oath. Either way, they've ensured that I lose everything. That's not enforceable, David protested. You can't contract away your duty as a federal agent. Maybe not in court, but look at the practical effect. If I report Marcus, his lawyers will claim I violated our confidentiality agreement. They'll argue that any evidence I gathered was obtained through illegal surveillance of my own husband. They'll move to suppress everything claiming spousal privilege and breach of contract. David was already on his computer pulling up case law. There have to be precedents for this. There are, and they're not good for law enforcement. I'd studied these cases in training. Spousal privilege is one of the strongest protections in law. Even when one spouse is a federal agent, courts are reluctant to allow testimony against the other spouse. We sat in silence for a moment, the magnitude of Marcus's legal preparations sinking in. This wasn't just a prenup, it was a carefully constructed legal maze designed to prevent exactly what I was trying to do. They planned this from the beginning, I said finally. Marcus didn't just marry me for my expertise, he married me to neutralize me. There has to be a way around this, David insisted. Criminal enterprises don't get to immunity marry federal agents. Ian, but I was already thinking like a forensic accountant, following the logic of the legal structure Marcus's lawyers had created. Actually, they might. If the marriage is legally valid and the prenup is enforceable, then any evidence I've gathered could be considered the fruit of an illegal search. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Running late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. I showed the message to David. Even now, he's maintaining the loving husband act. He probably thinks the prenup makes him untouchable. Does it? I studied the document again, my mind working through the legal implications. 5 years of marriage to a federal agent covered by a confidentiality agreement that could neutralize any testimony I might give. From a criminal defense perspective, it was brilliant. But Marcus had made one crucial error. David, I said slowly, what if I'm not the one who reports him? What do you mean, the prenup prevents me from testifying against Marcus, but it doesn't prevent me from being a witness to crimes committed against me. David's eyes lit up with understanding. You're not investigating your husband's business. You're investigating your own victimization. Exactly. Marriage fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Every time Marcus used my credentials without my knowledge, every time he manipulated me into providing information, every time he exploited our marriage for criminal purposes, those are crimes against me. I was already planning the approach in my head. The prenup protects Marcus from his wife testifying about his business, but it doesn't protect him from a federal agent testifying about crimes committed against her. It's a narrow distinction, David warned. It's enough, I replied. And David Marcus just made his biggest mistake. Which is... I smiled grimly, feeling the familiar rush of a complex investigation clicking into place. He gave me 5 years of access to every detail of his operation. He wanted me close enough to be useful, but didn't think I was smart enough to be dangerous. I stood my decision made. Time to show him how wrong he was. David and I spent the next hour mapping out our strategy. We couldn't move through normal channels, too much risk of exposure, too many people who might tip off the Whitmore organization. Instead, we'd build a parallel investigation using my unique position as both insider and victim. First priority, David said, is establishing that you were manipulated without your knowledge. We need evidence that Marcus deliberately deceived you about the nature of his business. I can get that. I replied, thinking about 5 years of conversations I'd dismissed as loving interest in my work. He documented his own manipulation, Every time he asked about my cases, every time he suggested ways to improve financial investigations, I can reconstruct all of it. What about immediate safety? If Marcus realizes you're investigating, he won't, I said with more confidence than I felt. I'm the grateful wife from Hialeah. Remember, Victoria made it clear they don't see me as a threat. But even as I said it, I was planning precautions. Copies of evidence stored in multiple locations, communication protocols that couldn't be traced to FBI systems' exit strategies if Marcus became suspicious. Elena, David said quietly, are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. Your marriage, your life as you know it, it's all going to change. I thought about my parents who'd worked 2 jobs each to send me to college, about the oath I'd taken as a federal agent, about the trafficking victims whose suffering had been enabled by my unwitting assistance. My marriage was already over, I said finally. I just didn't know it yet. We agreed to meet the next morning to begin formal documentation. David would reach out to trusted contacts in other agencies carefully, quietly, without triggering any alerts that might reach Whitmore's contacts in law enforcement. As I gathered my things to leave the office, David caught my arm. Elena, what Marcus and his family did to you? It's not your fault. You were targeted by professionals who've been perfecting this game for decades. I nodded, but the guilt still gnawed at me. How many crimes had been enabled by my credentials? How many victims had suffered while I played the loving wife? I know, I said, but that doesn't change what I have to do now. That evening, I returned to our Coral Gables home and began the most difficult performance of my life, pretending to be the woman Marcus thought he'd married. I cooked dinner, asked about his day, smiled when he complimented my outfit. But while Marcus read through business documents in his study, I was memorizing every detail of our home cataloging, every conversation, every phone call, every casual mention of business that I'd previously ignored. Tomorrow, I would begin the systematic destruction of the criminal empire my husband had built. Tonight, I was still playing the role of the perfect wife. It would be my final performance. The next morning, I arrived at the FBI building 30 minutes early. My mind sharp despite the sleepless night I'd spent cataloging 5 years of memories with new eyes. Every casual question Marcus had asked about my cases, every time he'd steered conversations toward federal investigation techniques, every moment I'd mistaken manipulation for marital interest, it all formed a pattern that made my stomach churn. David was already at his desk, a stack of case files beside his computer, and the grim expression of someone who'd spent the night researching spousal manipulation in federal law enforcement. Coffee, he offered, gesturing to the break room. God, yes. In the relative privacy of the break room, David handed me a steaming mug and kept his voice low. I spent half the night on secure channels reaching out to contacts who might help us. Good news and bad news. Bad news first. Spousal privilege in federal cases is even more complicated than we thought. There are precedents where criminal enterprises specifically targeted federal agents for marriage to gain legal protection. I sipped the coffee, letting the caffeine steady my nerves. And the good news, I found someone who's dealt with this before. Detective Sarah Martinez, Miami-Dade Financial Crimes. She worked a case 3 years ago where a county prosecutor's wife was running a human trafficking ring. Similar legal complications. The name was familiar. Sarah Martinez. Didn't she testify in the Delgado corruption case? That's her. Tough as nails, completely trustworthy, and she has contacts throughout South Florida law enforcement. If anyone can help us navigate the legal maze, it's Sarah. David pulled out his personal phone. I texted her last night carefully. Asked if she'd consult on a hypothetical case involving spousal manipulation of law enforcement. She's meeting us for lunch. 2 hours later, we sat in a small Cuban cafe in Little Havana, far from the federal building and the social circles where Marcus might have connections. Detective Sarah Martinez was exactly what I'd expected from David's description, mid-40s silver threading through her black hair, and the kind of direct gaze that came from years of dealing with criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. So, Sarah said after we'd ordered, hypothetically speaking, we're talking about a federal agent who discovered her husband is running a criminal enterprise, but the prenup prevents her from testifying against him. Hypothetically, David confirmed. Sarah studied me for a moment. Honey, there's nothing hypothetical about that look in your eyes. You've got the same expression I had when I realized my partner was taking bribes from drug dealers. I met her gaze. How did you handle it? Carefully, and with a lot of backup. Sarah leaned forward. The prosecutor case I worked, Elena Vasquez, good woman, thought she was married to a legitimate businessman. Turned out her husband was using her prosecutorial credentials to identify witnesses, intimidate victims, even influence case assignments. What happened to her? She's now a federal judge, but it took 2 years of careful investigation to separate her from her husband's crimes and prove she was a victim, not an accomplice. David and I exchanged glances. 2 years. Could be faster in your case, Sarah said, depending on how sophisticated your documentation is. The key is proving ongoing deception and establishing a clear timeline of manipulation. Over the next hour, Sarah walked us through the approach that had worked in the Vasquez case. The strategy was methodical, built on the same principles I used in financial investigations: document everything, establish patterns, follow the money, and build an irrefutable case brick by brick. First, you need allies, Sarah explained. People who can work parallel investigations without triggering official attention. I know an immigration lawyer, Maria Santos, who specializes in trafficking cases. She might have insights into the maritime operations you described. What about federal oversight? I asked. If we're investigating potential corruption of federal agents. That's where it gets tricky, Sarah admitted. We need someone high enough in the federal hierarchy to provide protection, but low enough to avoid political complications. There's a woman I know, Judge Carmen Delgado, federal bench in the Southern District. She's got a reputation for being untouchable by political pressure. David was taking notes on his personal phone. Judge Delgado, isn't she the one who handled the Port Authority corruption cases? The same. If Whitmore has people inside the Port Authority, Carmen would be exactly the right person to coordinate a federal response. As lunch progressed, Sarah outlined the team we'd need to build. Each person would handle a specific aspect of the investigation while maintaining plausible deniability and operational security. The immigration lawyer, Maria Santos, she's handled dozens of maritime trafficking cases. If Whitmore Maritime is moving people, she'll recognize the patterns. What about media? I asked. If this goes public before we're ready. There's a journalist, Michael Torres, at the Miami Herald. He's been investigating Port Authority corruption for years, but hasn't been able to make the connections. Give him the right information at the right time, and he'll help control the narrative. By the time we finished lunch, we had the skeleton of an operational team. Sarah would coordinate with local law enforcement, providing cover for surveillance and evidence gathering. Maria would analyze the human trafficking aspects. Judge Delgado would provide federal oversight once we had enough evidence to justify official action. One more thing, Sarah said as we prepared to leave. You're going to need technical support. Financial crimes this sophisticated require digital forensics beyond what any of us can handle alone. She handed me a business card. Dr. Rosa Herrera, University of Miami. She's a forensic accounting professor, but she consults for law enforcement on complex international cases. More importantly, she's got contacts in the Cayman Islands who can trace offshore transactions. I looked at the card, Dr. Rosa Herrera, PhD, CPA, Forensic Accounting Division. Can we trust her? Rosa mentored me when I was getting my financial crime certification, Sarah replied. She's the one who taught me that following money trails is like following breadcrumbs. Eventually, they always lead you home. That afternoon, I returned to the FBI building with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just investigating my husband's crimes anymore. I was building a coalition of professionals who could bring down the entire Whitmore criminal enterprise. David and I spent the rest of the day establishing secure communication protocols and beginning the delicate process of documenting my 5 years of unwitting complicity. Every federal database I'd accessed at Marcus's subtle suggestion, every conversation about investigation techniques, every time my credentials had opened doors for Whitmore business dealings. The pattern was clear and damning. Marcus had been using me as an inside source from the moment we'd met, and I'd been too blinded by love to see it. But now I could see everything. Elena, David said as we prepared to leave for the day, are you ready for tomorrow? Tomorrow we'd begin reaching out to our potential allies. Tomorrow I'd start the process of systematically dismantling the life I'd thought I was building. I'm ready, I said. And for the first time since overhearing that conversation at the Bal Harbor Club, I meant it. As I drove home to our Coral Gables house, the house I now knew was purchased with laundered money, I thought about Dr. Herrera's breadcrumbs metaphor. Marcus had been following a trail that led to power and wealth built on suffering. I was about to show him where that trail really ended. The next week fell into a carefully orchestrated routine. Each morning, I arrived at the FBI building and performed my regular duties with David on legitimate cases maintaining the appearance of normal operations. But underneath the surface, we were building something else entirely, a comprehensive investigation into the criminal enterprise I'd been living with for 5 years. Dr. Rosa Herrera proved to be exactly the ally Sarah had promised. At 62, with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades detecting financial deception, she brought a level of expertise that complemented my federal training perfectly. "Elena," she said during our first meeting at her University of Miami office, "I've been tracking Caribbean money laundering operations for 20 years. What you've described isn't just sophisticated, it's evolved. Someone's been learning from every federal investigation, adapting techniques faster than law enforcement can respond." She pulled up a complex diagram on her computer screen showing financial flows between dozens of offshore entities. "This is what a modern laundering operation looks like. Shell companies in 12 different jurisdictions, each with different banking laws, different reporting requirements." I studied the diagram, my trained eye picking out the patterns. The complexity is intentional. It's designed to overwhelm investigators with paperwork. Exactly. But there's always a weakness. Rosa highlighted several connections on the diagram. No matter how complex the structure, money has to flow back to the real world eventually. That's where we catch them. Over the next several days, Rosa and I worked together to map the complete Whitmore financial structure. Using my federal database access and her offshore contacts, we traced money flows that painted a disturbing picture. Whitmore Development reported annual revenues of $200 million from legitimate resort operations. But the offshore subsidiaries showed cash flows exceeding $800 million annually, money that had no corresponding business activities in the legitimate operations. "Where's the extra $600 million coming from?" Rosa asked, though we both suspected the answer. "Human trafficking," I said grimly. "Marcus mentioned increased cargo volume after the Port Miami expansion. That's not construction materials, that's people." The evidence mounted systematically. Maritime shipping manifests that declared lightweight cargo but showed heavy tonnage. Resort properties with construction expenses that far exceeded any visible improvements. Cayman Islands bank transfers that corresponded to known trafficking routes between South America and the United States. But the most damning evidence came from my own federal records. Rosa helped me trace every time my credentials had been used to legitimize Whitmore operations. Federal database searches I'd forgotten about performed at Marcus's casual suggestions. Expert consultations I'd provided for academic research that had actually been used to improve money laundering techniques. Official letters I'd written as a federal agent vouching for the legitimacy of Whitmore business dealings. "Elena," Rosa said after we'd compiled 3 days of documentation, "this isn't just marriage fraud. They've been using you to corrupt federal investigations for 5 years." The scope of my unwitting complicity was staggering. I'd provided expert testimony that helped close investigations into Caribbean money laundering. I'd consulted on cases where Whitmore entities were tangentially involved, never recognizing the connections. I'd even co-authored a paper on detecting maritime trafficking that had been used to improve criminal techniques. Meanwhile, Maria Santos was building the human trafficking case from the victim perspective. The immigration lawyer had contacts throughout Miami's immigrant communities, and the stories she uncovered were heartbreaking. 12 families in the last 2 years, Maria reported during one of our secure evening meetings at her Coral Gables office. All missing relatives who were promised work at Caribbean resorts. All last-seen boarding vessels operated by Whitmore Maritime. She showed us photographs and documents desperate families' fake employment contracts, shipping records that didn't match official manifests. The pattern was clear. Whitmore wasn't just laundering money, they were trafficking people. "The families are terrified to speak officially," Maria continued. "Immigration status, fear of retaliation, language barriers, but they'll testify if we can guarantee protection." Each piece of evidence added weight to our case, but it also added urgency. Every day we delayed meant more victims, more families destroyed by the Whitmore operation. Sarah Martinez coordinated the surveillance aspects of our investigation. Using her Miami-Dade connections, she established discreet monitoring of Whitmore facilities and personnel without triggering federal oversight systems that might alert Marcus's law enforcement contacts. The Star Island mansion has regular late-night visitors, Sarah reported. High-end vehicles, brief meetings, patterns consistent with money distribution operations. She showed us surveillance photos taken from public areas, expensive cars arriving at odd hours, brief exchanges in the mansion's circular driveway, individuals who matched known profiles of money laundering intermediaries. What about the Port Miami facilities? David asked. That's where it gets interesting, Sarah replied. Whitmore Maritime has exclusive access to Terminal 7 supposedly for resort cargo operations, but the activity patterns don't match legitimate shipping. Sarah's surveillance had documented after-hours activities at the terminal trucks, arriving without corresponding shipping schedules. Containers being moved during periods when no official cargo operations were scheduled, security patterns that suggested the terminal was being used for purposes beyond its official designation. The most disturbing discovery came when we analyzed the timing of these activities against federal inspection schedules. Elena, David said, his voice tight with anger. Look at this correlation. He'd overlaid Sarah's surveillance timeline with federal inspection schedules from the customs database I had access to. The pattern was unmistakable. Suspicious activities at Terminal 7 always occurred during periods when federal inspections had been canceled or postponed. They're using real-time information about federal operations, I realized. Someone's feeding them our inspection schedules. The implication was clear. Marcus's network included corrupted federal officials beyond just me. My unwitting assistance had been part of a larger operation to compromise federal oversight of Port Miami operations. Dr. Herrera's offshore investigations provided the final piece of our systematic evidence gathering. Her Cayman Islands contacts had traced the ultimate destination of Whitmore's laundered money, a network of Swiss and Luxembourgish accounts that funded operations across the Caribbean and South America. This isn't just a Miami operation, Rosa explained during our final evidence compilation meeting. Whitmore is the American hub of an international trafficking network. The money trail connects to operations in Colombia, Venezuela, and Haiti. She showed us financial flows that painted a comprehensive picture: drugs moving north, money moving south, and people being trafficked in both directions. The Caribbean resorts weren't just money laundering fronts. They were logistics hubs for a criminal empire that spanned the hemisphere. The scale is unprecedented, Rosa continued. We're looking at billions of dollars in annual criminal activity coordinated across multiple countries and criminal organizations. As we compiled our evidence into a comprehensive case file, the magnitude of what we'd uncovered became clear. This wasn't just about my marriage or even Marcus's individual crimes. We'd documented a criminal enterprise that corrupted federal law enforcement, exploited desperate immigrants, and generated massive profits from human suffering. But we'd also documented something else: my own 5 years of unwitting complicity in these crimes. Elena, Sarah said as we prepared to move to the next phase of our investigation. You know what comes next, right? I nodded. Official reporting, federal task force involvement, the end of any pretense that this is still my marriage. Are you ready for that? I thought about the trafficking victims Maria had identified, the families destroyed by Whitmore operations, the federal investigations that had been corrupted by my unwitting assistance. I've been ready since the moment I heard Marcus planning my replacement, I replied. Now I'm just properly armed. David gathered our compiled evidence, financial records, surveillance reports, victim testimonies, corruption documentation into secure files that would form the foundation of a federal investigation. Tomorrow, he said, we take this to Judge Delgado and make it official. But as I drove home that evening, I knew that making it official was just the beginning. Marcus had spent 5 years building a criminal empire using my expertise and credentials. Destroying that empire would require everything I'd learned about financial investigation, plus some techniques that weren't covered in federal training manuals. The systematic evidence gathering was complete. Now came the part where we turned that evidence into justice. Judge Carmen Delgado's federal chambers were austere in the way that only true power could afford to be plain wooden furniture law books, instead of decoration and the kind of quiet that came from decisions that shaped lives. At 58, she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd climbed to the federal bench through merit rather than connections. Agent Rodriguez, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Detective Martinez has given me the broad outline of your situation. I understand you've uncovered evidence of systematic corruption involving federal law enforcement. David and I had spent the morning in the judge's secure conference room presenting our compiled evidence while Sarah and Dr. Herrera provided technical support via encrypted connection. The presentation had taken 3 hours, walking through 5 years of documented criminal activity that implicated not just Marcus, but potentially dozens of federal officials. Your Honor, I began, what we've discovered goes beyond individual corruption. This is a systematic compromise of federal oversight that's enabled international trafficking operations. Judge Delgado reviewed the financial charts Dr. Herrera had prepared, her expression growing darker with each page. Agent Rodriguez, are you prepared to testify that you unknowingly provided assistance to these criminal operations? Yes, Your Honor. And I'm prepared to provide documentation of every instance where my federal credentials were used to legitimize criminal activities. The judge set down the charts and studied me directly. Agent Rodriguez, you understand that cooperating with this investigation may expose you to criminal liability for your unwitting assistance. I understand, Your Honor. But the alternative is allowing these operations to continue while more people suffer. Judge Delgado was quiet for a long moment, weighing the legal and political implications of what we were asking her to authorize. A federal investigation into corrupted law enforcement led by an agent who'd been manipulated by her own husband would generate headlines and congressional hearings. Very well, she said finally. I'm authorizing a federal task force under sealed warrant. Agent Chen, you'll coordinate with Agent Rodriguez under my direct supervision. Detective Martinez, your department will provide operational support. She turned to her computer, beginning the process of creating official documentation that would transform our informal investigation into federal law enforcement action. Agent Rodriguez, she continued, I'm placing you on modified duty pending resolution of this investigation. You'll retain your credentials and database access, but you'll report directly to me, rather than through normal bureau channels. The relief was overwhelming. Instead of being suspended or investigated as a potential accomplice, I was being positioned as the primary federal asset in taking down the Whitmore operation. But Judge Delgado wasn't finished. However, she said, her voice taking on a warning tone, from this moment forward, every action you take is under federal oversight. Your marriage to Marcus Whitmore is now evidence in a federal investigation. Any communication with him must be documented and reported. The reality hit me like cold water. My marriage wasn't just over, it was now a federal crime scene. David spoke up. Your Honor, what about Agent Rodriguez's safety? If Marcus Whitmore suspects she's cooperating with federal authorities. That's my primary concern, Judge Delgado replied. Agent Rodriguez, you'll maintain your normal routine as much as possible, but you'll be under discreet federal protection. Any sign that your cover is compromised, and we extract you immediately. As we left the federal courthouse, the enormity of what we'd just initiated began to sink in. We'd gone from investigating my husband's crimes to coordinating a federal task force that would target an international criminal enterprise. Elena, Sarah said as we walked to our cars. You realize there's no going back now, right? Even if you wanted to reconcile with Marcus. I interrupted. But even if I did, Judge Delgado just made it clear that my marriage is evidence in a federal case. There is no personal life anymore, only the investigation. That evening, I returned to our Coral Gables home with new eyes. Every room was now a potential crime scene. Every conversation with Marcus, a documented federal interaction. Every moment of our domestic life, a performance under federal supervision. Marcus was in his study when I arrived, the same room where I'd seen him destroy evidence, the same desk where he'd planned my replacement with his mother. But now, instead of the loving wife hurt by betrayal, I was a federal agent gathering evidence against a criminal target. How was your day? He asked, looking up from financial documents that I now knew detailed criminal operations rather than legitimate business. Busy. I replied, the recording device Sarah had given me capturing every word. The Petrov case is getting complicated. These international money laundering networks are incredibly sophisticated. Marcus's eyes sharpened with the interest I'd once mistaken for intellectual curiosity. Sophisticated how? Multiple jurisdictions, shell companies in different countries timing that suggests they have inside information about federal investigations. I watched his reaction carefully, noting the slight tension that suggested my words had hit close to home. Must be frustrating, Marcus said, knowing that criminals are staying ahead of federal law enforcement. It is, I agreed. But eventually they all make mistakes. Money always leaves a trail, no matter how sophisticated the laundering operation. That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about the conversation. He'd been probing for information about federal investigation techniques just as he had for 5 years. But now, instead of unknowingly providing assistance to criminal operations, I was feeding him information designed to trigger mistakes. The federal task force was operational. Judge Delgado had authorized surveillance financial investigations and coordination with international law enforcement. Dr. Herrera was tracing money flows through offshore accounts. Maria Santos was preparing trafficking victims to testify under federal protection. And I was now a federal asset positioned at the heart of a criminal enterprise that had no idea the investigation was closing in. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something crucial. The Whitmore operation was too sophisticated, too well protected, too confident in its immunity from federal prosecution. Marcus had spent 5 years learning from my expertise. What else had he learned? And who else was he learning from? Those questions would be answered sooner than I expected. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my own federal database alerts. 3 days after Judge Delgado had authorized our task force, I arrived at the FBI building to find my computer flagged with a priority notification. Someone had been running searches on Elena Rodriguez through multiple federal systems, probing my background, my cases, even my family's immigration records. David, I called across our workspace, my voice tight with alarm. Someone's investigating me. He crossed to my desk quickly, reading over my shoulder as I pulled up the search logs. The queries were sophisticated, using administrative access codes that suggested someone with high-level federal clearance. These searches originated from different agencies, David observed. Justice Department, Homeland Security, even Treasury. Whoever's doing this has access across multiple federal systems. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus's network didn't just include corrupted local officials, they had people embedded throughout federal law enforcement. Elena, David said quietly, if they know you're investigating, they don't just know. I interrupted my forensic mind, analyzing the search patterns. Look at the timing. These searches started the day after our meeting with Judge Delgado. Someone had been monitoring federal judicial activity, tracking sealed warrant authorizations, possibly even listening to conversations in what should have been secure federal facilities. I called Sarah Martinez on her encrypted phone. We have a problem. They know. How much do they know? Sarah's voice was crisp, professional, the tone of someone shifting into crisis mode. Everything. Someone with federal access has been tracking our investigation since we made it official. Within an hour, our entire team had assembled in Dr. Herrera's university office, the one location we were certain hadn't been compromised by federal surveillance. The atmosphere was tense, everyone understanding that our careful investigation had been blown open by the very system we'd trusted to protect it. The good news, Judge Delgado said, via encrypted video connection, is that this confirms everything you've alleged about systematic federal corruption. The bad news is that you're now in immediate danger. Dr. Herrera pulled up her latest financial analysis. I've been tracking the money flows more aggressively since we got authorization. Elena, what we're dealing with is even worse than we thought. The financial charts she displayed made our previous estimates look conservative. Whitmore wasn't maritime, wasn't just facilitating trafficking. They were the primary logistics hub for criminal operations spanning from Colombia to Canada. Annual throughput is approaching $2 billion, Dr. Herrera explained. That's not just money laundering, that's the kind of volume that requires coordination with major drug cartels, international trafficking networks, and... She paused, highlighting a series of transactions that made my blood run cold. Government contracts. Elena Whitmore Maritime has been receiving federal payments for national security operations that correspond exactly with their largest trafficking activities. The room fell silent as the full scope of the corruption became clear. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise that had compromised federal agents. It was a criminal enterprise that was being funded by the federal government. Jesus Christ. Sarah breathed. They're using federal contracts to legitimize trafficking operations. Maria Santos spoke up from her position near the window where she'd been monitoring for surveillance. That explains why the victims' families were so terrified to speak. They weren't just afraid of criminals, they were afraid of the government. I felt sick. For 5 years, I'd been living with a man who was using federal resources to facilitate human trafficking. My expertise, my credentials, my unwitting assistance, all of it had been used to perfect a system that turned government agencies into accomplices in international crime. Elena, Judge Delgado said through the encrypted connection, I need you to understand the position this puts us in. We're not just investigating corruption, we're investigating treason. David was already on his laptop cross-referencing the federal contract information with known trafficking routes. The contracts are classified under national security provisions. Someone's been using counter-terrorism funding to support criminal operations. Which means, Dr. Herrera added grimly, that exposing this will implicate people at the highest levels of federal law enforcement and national security. The scope of what we'd uncovered was staggering. A criminal enterprise that had penetrated multiple federal agencies, corrupted national security operations, and generated billions in profits while destroying countless lives. But it also explained Marcus's confidence, Victoria's certainty that they were untouchable. They weren't just protected by money and lawyers, they were protected by federal agencies that couldn't afford to admit how deeply they'd been compromised. So what do we do? Maria asked. If the system is this corrupt, how do we use that same system to achieve justice? Judge Delgado's voice was firm through the encrypted speaker. We go around the system. International law enforcement, congressional oversight, and media exposure. We make this too public to cover up. Sarah was already making notes. I have contacts in the DEA and ATF who've been frustrated by federal inaction on trafficking cases. If we approach this as an international operation, we'll need evidence that's bulletproof, I interrupted. Everything we've compiled could be dismissed as the revenge fantasy of a bitter wife. We need something that proves the federal connection beyond any doubt. Dr. Herrera was studying her financial charts with new intensity. Elena, what if I told you that Whitmore's operation requires real-time access to federal databases? Not just the searches you've identified, but active coordination with federal operations. What do you mean? The timing of their trafficking activities corresponds perfectly with federal law enforcement operations in source countries. When DEA raids cartels in Colombia, Whitmore's shipping routes change immediately. When Coast Guard patrol patterns shift their vessels, adjust routes accordingly. The implication was clear: someone was providing real-time federal intelligence to coordinate criminal operations. That's not corruption, David said quietly. That's active collaboration between federal agencies and international criminals. Judge Delgado's voice cut through our discussion. Agent Rodriguez, I need you to understand that from this moment forward, you're not just investigating your husband's crimes. You're investigating potential treason by federal officials at the highest levels. I understand, Your Honor. Do you, because what you're about to do will make you enemies in agencies that have the power to destroy your life, your family, and everyone you care about. I thought about the trafficking victims Maria had identified, the families destroyed by Whitmore operations, the federal resources being used to facilitate international crime. Your Honor, I said finally, they already destroyed my life. I just didn't know it yet. Very well. Agent Chen, you'll coordinate with international law enforcement through secure channels. Detective Martinez, prepare for possible federal retaliation against local operations. Dr. Herrera, compile everything we'll need for congressional testimony. As our team prepared to escalate from federal investigation to international law enforcement action, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a line from which there would be no return. But Marcus had crossed that line 5 years ago when he'd married a federal agent to facilitate international trafficking. Now it was time to show him what happened when you weaponize the expertise of someone who dedicated her life to justice. The next phase of our investigation required expertise beyond what any of us possessed individually. Judge Delgado's authorization had opened doors to international law enforcement cooperation, but exploiting those opportunities would require specialists who understood the complex web of agencies and jurisdictions involved in combating international crime. Herrera took the lead in assembling our expanded team, using her decades of contacts in academic and law enforcement circles to identify the experts we'd need. First priority, she explained during our strategy session, is someone who understands the intersection of federal contracts and international crime. What you've uncovered requires expertise in both national security law and international trafficking. She'd identified Professor Alexandra Petrov at Georgetown Law, a former federal prosecutor who'd specialized in national security cases before transitioning to academia. Dr. Petrov had written extensively about the use of classified contracts to obscure criminal activity, and her security clearance would allow her to review the federal documents we'd uncovered. Second, we need someone who can coordinate with international law enforcement without triggering the federal surveillance that's been tracking your investigation. For this doctor, Herrera had reached out to Captain Luis Morales of the Coast Guard Intelligence Division. Captain Morales had been investigating Caribbean trafficking routes for years, but his efforts had been consistently frustrated by what he'd suspected was federal interference. Captain Morales has been documenting cases where Coast Guard operations were compromised by real-time intelligence leaks, Dr. Herrera explained. He's been building his own case against federal corruption, but he's lacked the financial evidence to prove coordination between agencies and criminal organizations. The third addition to our team came through Maria Santos's immigration law connections. Dr. Carmen Ruiz, a psychologist who specialized in trafficking victim testimony and trauma recovery. Dr. Ruiz had worked with hundreds of trafficking victims and understood the psychological patterns that would help us verify the accounts Maria had compiled. Our first meeting as an expanded team took place at Georgetown Law School in Professor Petrov's secure conference room. The security measures were impressive electronic counter-surveillance equipment, encrypted communication systems, and legal protections that made our conversations privileged under attorney-client confidentiality. Agent Rodriguez, Professor Petrov began after we'd completed our security protocols. Dr. Herrera has briefed me on your situation. What you've uncovered represents one of the most sophisticated corruption schemes I've encountered in 20 years of national security law. She activated a secure presentation system displaying organizational charts that map the relationships between federal agencies, private contractors, and international criminal organizations. The use of classified national security contracts to legitimize criminal operations isn't new, but the scale you've documented is unprecedented. These operations require coordination at levels that suggest systematic compromise of multiple agencies. Captain Morales added his perspective from the maritime enforcement side. Agent Rodriguez, I've been tracking suspicious patterns in Coast Guard operations for 3 years. Patrol schedules being leaked, boarding operations being called off at the last minute, intelligence reports that seem designed to help traffickers avoid detection. He showed us Coast Guard incident reports that painted a disturbing picture of federal law enforcement operations that seemed coordinated to avoid interfering with Whitmore maritime activities. The pattern became clear when I started tracking the financial flows Dr. Herrera identified. Every time Coast Guard operations were compromised, money moved through Whitmore accounts within hours. Dr. Ruiz provided the human perspective that grounded our investigation in the reality of its victims. She'd reviewed Maria's compiled testimonies and identified patterns that confirmed the systematic nature of Whitmore's trafficking operations. The psychological profiles are consistent with organized long-term trafficking operations, she explained. These aren't random crimes of opportunity, they're part of a systematic process designed to maximize profit while minimizing the possibility of victim cooperation with law enforcement. She displayed anonymized victim accounts that revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation used to control trafficking victims. Threats against family members, deliberate creation of immigration violations that made victims afraid to contact authorities, and systematic destruction of identification documents that made victims dependent on their traffickers. Most disturbing, Dr. Ruiz continued, is the evidence that victims were specifically told that law enforcement was complicit in their trafficking. They were shown federal documents told that reporting their situation would result in their own prosecution. The room fell silent as the full scope of the psychological warfare became clear. Whitmore's operation didn't just traffic people, it systematically destroyed their ability to seek help by convincing them that the government itself was complicit. As our expanded team coordinated their expertise, the investigative strategy evolved from reactive documentation to proactive law enforcement action. We weren't just gathering evidence anymore, we were building a case that could be prosecuted simultaneously in federal court, international tribunals, and congressional oversight hearings. Professor Petrov coordinated the legal framework that would allow us to pursue charges across multiple jurisdictions. The international nature of these crimes gives us options beyond federal prosecution. If U.S. agencies are compromised, we can coordinate with Canadian, European, and Caribbean law enforcement. Captain Morales established secure communication channels with international maritime enforcement agencies. The Caribbean Maritime Security Initiative has been looking for evidence of systematic trafficking coordination. What we've compiled gives them the justification they need for coordinated international action. Dr. Herrera expanded her financial analysis to include international banking systems and offshore regulatory authorities. If we can demonstrate that Whitmore's operations violate international banking laws, we can trigger asset seizures in multiple countries simultaneously. But the most crucial development came from Dr. Ruiz's victim advocacy work. Through her trauma counseling networks, she'd identified victims who were willing to testify under international protection protocols. 12 individuals have agreed to provide testimony to international authorities, she reported. They're terrified of U.S. federal agencies, but they trust international human rights organizations. As our team finalized its coordinated approach, I realized we'd evolved from investigating my husband's crimes to coordinating an international law enforcement operation. The scope was both exhilarating and terrifying. We were challenging not just individual criminals, but systematic corruption within the federal government itself. Agent Rodriguez, Professor Petrov said as our meeting concluded, "You understand that what we're undertaking will make you a target not just of criminal organizations, but potentially of the federal agencies you've served." "I understand," I replied, "but the alternative is allowing systematic trafficking to continue while federal resources are used to facilitate international crime." David spoke up from across the table. "Elena, once we trigger international law enforcement action, there's no controlling the scope of the investigation. This could expose corruption throughout federal law enforcement." I thought about the trafficking victims Dr. Ruiz had described about 5 years of my expertise being used to perfect criminal operations about federal contracts funding international trafficking. "Good," I said finally. "Maybe it's time federal law enforcement was held accountable for its complicity in international crime." Captain Morales smiled grimly. "Agent Rodriguez, I've been waiting 3 years for someone with the expertise and the courage to say that." As our expanded team dispersed to begin coordinated international action, I knew we'd crossed the point of no return. We weren't just investigating corruption anymore, we were challenging the entire system that had enabled it. Marcus had married a federal agent thinking he'd gained access to expertise and credentials that would protect his criminal empire. He was about to learn that he'd actually married someone with the knowledge and connections to bring down systematic federal corruption. The call came at 2:17 a.m., jarring me awake in the guest bedroom where I'd been sleeping since beginning the federal investigation. Marcus still believed our growing distance was due to work stress and other performance I maintained while gathering evidence against his criminal empire. "Elena." My mother's voice was shaky, afraid. "Mija, there are men here. They say they're from immigration." I shot upright, instantly alert. "Mommy, what men? What do they want?" "They have Badge's official papers. They say there are problems with our citizenship documentation that we need to come with them for questioning." My blood ran cold. My parents had been naturalized citizens for over 20 years, their documentation impeccable. This wasn't a legitimate immigration investigation. It was intimidation designed to pressure me through my family. "Mommy, don't go anywhere with them. Tell them you want to call your lawyer. I'm coming now." But as I grabbed my keys and federal ID, my phone rang again. This time it was my brother Carlos, his voice tight with the controlled anger I recognized from his police training. "Elena, we need to talk. Now." "Carlos, I'm heading to Mommy and Poppy's. I know about the immigration visit." He interrupted. "I'm the one who told them to make it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stopped, moving phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what my brother had just said. "What did you just say?" "Elena, you need to stop whatever you're doing. You're putting the whole family at risk." I sank onto the edge of the bed, my mind racing through the implications. Carlos was a detective with Miami-Dade Police Sarah Martinez's department. He'd have access to information about our investigation contacts within federal agencies. Carlos, what have you done? What I had to do to protect our family. His voice was defensive but strained. Elena, you have no idea what you're messing with. These people don't just prosecute, they destroy. They make people disappear. These people, Carlos, who have you been talking to? Silence on the line, then a sigh that carried 20 years of my big brother's protective instincts. Marcus contacted me 2 weeks ago. He said you were having some kind of breakdown investigating conspiracy theories that could destroy your career and put the family in danger. The manipulation was so sophisticated it took my breath away. Marcus had used my brother's protective instincts against me, convincing him that I was the threat to our family's safety. Carlos Marcus is lying. Elena, stop. I've seen the federal investigation reports. You're targeting your own husband with accusations that make you sound paranoid and vindictive. You're going to destroy your career and take us all down with you. Federal investigation reports. My stomach dropped as I realized the scope of the betrayal. Someone had been feeding Carlos information about our classified investigation using official federal documents to convince him that I was the problem. Carlos, listen to me. Marcus is a criminal. He's using federal resources to facilitate international trafficking. The investigation is real. It's authorized by a federal judge. And, Elena, you're talking about conspiracy theories involving multiple federal agencies. Do you hear yourself? You sound like one of those internet people who think the government is controlled by criminals. The irony was devastating. My brother, an experienced detective, couldn't believe that federal corruption existed on the scale we documented because it sounded too outrageous to be real. Carlos, I need you to trust me. Can you meet me somewhere? Let me show you the evidence. I can't do that, Elena. I've already reported your activities to my superiors. Miami-Dade is cooperating with federal authorities to ensure you get the help you need. The help I needed. They'd convinced my own brother that I was having a mental breakdown, that my investigation into systematic federal corruption was evidence of psychological instability. Carlos, please, just give me 1 hour to explain. Elena, I'm sorry. The immigration visit is a warning. If you don't stop this investigation, if you don't get professional help, there will be consequences for the whole family. The line went dead. I sat in the darkness of the guest bedroom phone in my hand, understanding that Marcus's network had just played their most devastating card. They'd turned my own family against me using official federal channels to convince my brother that I was the threat. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your family's safety depends on your cooperation. End the investigation now or face the consequences. But underneath the text was a photo that made my blood freeze. My parents' house taken from across the street with timestamp showing it had been captured just minutes ago. They weren't just threatening me anymore. They were threatening my family, using my brother as an unwitting accomplice in their intimidation campaign. I called David on his encrypted phone. Elena, it's 3 a.m. They got to my family. My brother's been compromised. Immigration is threatening my parents, and someone's been feeding Carlos official federal reports to convince him I'm having a breakdown. David was instantly alert. Where are you now? At home. But David, they know everything about our investigation. Carlos mentioned federal investigation reports. Someone's been using our classified documentation to manipulate my family. Elena, you need to get out of there now. If they're willing to threaten your family directly, you're in immediate physical danger. But I was already thinking like a forensic accountant, analyzing the systematic nature of their approach. They'd used official federal channels to corrupt my brother, legitimate immigration authorities to threaten my parents, and classified investigation documents to make me appear unstable. David, I said slowly, this isn't just intimidation. This is evidence. What do you mean? They just proved that they have real-time access to our classified investigation. They used official federal resources to manipulate my family. They documented their own corruption. I was already planning how to turn their intimidation campaign into evidence of systematic federal complicity. Marcus thought he'd isolated me by turning my family against me. He'd actually given me proof of everything we'd been investigating. The next morning, I walked into our Coral Gables home to find Marcus waiting in the kitchen with coffee and croissants playing the role of the concerned husband with Oscar-worthy precision. "Elena, sweetheart, your brother called me last night. He's worried about you." I poured myself coffee, noting the micro-expressions that 5 years of marriage had taught me to read. The slight tension around his eyes that suggested he was calculating his next move, the careful modulation of his voice that indicated he was following a script. "Carlos is protective," I replied casually. "He always has been. He mentioned you've been under a lot of stress at work. Maybe it's time for a vacation. We could go to the Barbados resort, just the two of us." The Barbados resort, one of the Whitmore properties that Dr. Herrera had identified as a money laundering hub. Marcus was offering to take me directly into the heart of his criminal operation, probably planning for me to have an accident while we were in international waters. "That sounds lovely," I said, "but I can't leave Miami right now. We're at a critical point in the Petrov investigation." His eyes sharpened with interest. "The Russian money laundering case, I thought that was wrapping up." "Actually, it's expanding. We've discovered connections to Caribbean operations, possibly involving federal contractors with national security clearances." I watched him process this information, saw the moment when he realized I was talking about operations very similar to his own. "That sounds complicated," he said carefully. "It is. The financial structures are incredibly sophisticated, almost like someone's been teaching criminals how to exploit federal contract systems." Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate control. "Elena, you seem stressed. Your brother mentioned you've been making some unusual accusations about federal corruption." There it was, the admission that he'd been coordinating with Carlos, using my brother as a source of information about the federal investigation. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I know." "Know what?" "Everything. The trafficking operations, the federal contracts, the money laundering through Caribbean resorts. I know about your mother's coordination with corrupted federal officials. I know about the classified information you've been receiving about law enforcement operations." His face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a cold assessment that I'd never seen before. The mask of the loving husband completely disappeared, replaced by something that made me understand why trafficking victims had been terrified to seek help. "Elena," he said finally, his voice carrying a threat that was unmistakable, "you have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just business, this is national security. People who interfere with these operations don't just lose their careers, they disappear." "Is that a threat, Marcus?" "It's reality. You can end this investigation now and maintain your career and your family's safety, or you can continue and face consequences you can't imagine." I smiled, thinking about the federal task force, the international law enforcement coordination, the congressional oversight that was already in motion. "Marcus," I said, "you married the wrong federal agent." And the transformation in Marcus was immediate and complete. Gone was any pretense of the loving husband, replaced by the calculating criminal who'd been hiding behind our marriage for 5 years. He stood slowly, his movement deliberate and threatening. "Elena, you need to understand something. This conversation never happened. You're going to call your federal task force and tell them you made a mistake, that your investigation was based on personal animosity rather than evidence." "Am I?" "Yes, because the alternative is watching your family suffer for your mistakes." He pulled out his phone, showing me a live video feed from my parents' house. "Immigration isn't the only agency with an interest in your family's documentation." The video showed unmarked vehicles outside my parents' home, men in suits watching the house with the casual confidence of people who knew they had official authorization. "The IRS is very interested in your father's small business accounting. It would be unfortunate if they discovered irregularities that required criminal prosecution." My father's accounting firm? The modest practice he'd built over 20 years of honest work serving Miami's immigrant community, with the kind of integrity that had inspired my own career in financial investigation. "Of course," Marcus continued, "your brother Carlos might face departmental review if certain information about his cooperation with federal investigations became public. Internal Affairs takes a very dim view of officers who compromise ongoing investigations." The systematic nature of their threats was breathtaking. They'd identified pressure points for every member of my family, using legitimate federal agencies as weapons of intimidation. But I'd spent 5 years learning from Marcus, absorbing his techniques for manipulating federal systems. Now it was time to show him how much I'd learned. "Marcus," I said, pulling out my own phone. "You should know that this conversation is being recorded and transmitted in real time to federal authorities." His confidence flickered for the first time. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "You've spent 5 years teaching me about the importance of documentation. I've been a very good student." I showed him the recording app on my phone, the encrypted transmission indicator showing that our conversation was being monitored by Judge Delgado's task force. "Every threat you just made against federal agents and their families has been documented and transmitted to federal authorities. Every admission of using government agencies for intimidation has been recorded." Marcus's face darkened as he realized the scope of his mistake. In his arrogance, he'd provided direct evidence of the systematic corruption we'd been investigating. "Elena, you're making a serious error in judgment. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people are involved. You think you're fighting criminals, but you're fighting the system itself." "Good," I replied. "Maybe it's time the system was held accountable." He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried years of practiced intimidation. "Your federal task force, your international law enforcement coordination, your evidence, none of it matters. We have people in every agency you're trying to use against us." "I know. That's why we went around them." For the first time, genuine confusion crossed his features. "What do you mean? International law enforcement, Marcus? Congressional oversight? Media coordination? While you were busy corrupting federal agencies, we were building a case through channels you don't control." I showed him my phone screen displaying news alerts that had just gone live. The Miami Herald's expose on federal corruption, the Congressional Committee announcement of hearings into trafficking operations, the international arrest warrants that had been issued through Interpol. "You see, Marcus, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that because you'd corrupted some federal agencies, you'd corrupted all law enforcement. But international trafficking is a global crime, and not everyone in the world is for sale." Marcus stepped back, his phone ringing with what I assumed were panicked calls from his network of accomplices. The carefully constructed criminal empire was crashing down around him, and he was finally understanding that his 5-year investment in corrupting a federal agent had backfired catastrophically. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes before. "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning. Because now, instead of being the grateful wife you thought you'd married, I'm the federal agent who's going to ensure that every person you've trafficked gets justice and every official you've corrupted faces prosecution." As Marcus rushed from the kitchen, presumably to coordinate damage control with his criminal network, I remained seated listening to Judge Delgado's voice through my encrypted earpiece. "Agent Rodriguez, we have everything we need. It's time to bring him down." Within hours of Marcus's panicked departure from our kitchen, the Whitmore criminal network began to unravel with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. Judge Delgado's task force had been monitoring all communications from our house, and Marcus's threats against federal agents and their families had triggered immediate protective protocols. "Agent Rodriguez." David's voice crackled through my encrypted earpiece as I watched unmarked federal vehicles take positions around our Coral Gables neighborhood. "We've got eyes on 12 vehicles moving toward known Whitmore properties. They're in full panic mode." From my kitchen window, I could see the controlled chaos of a federal operation in motion. Surveillance teams that had been invisible for weeks were now openly positioning themselves, no longer concerned with maintaining cover, since the investigation had moved from covert to active enforcement. My phone buzzed with urgent messages from the expanded team. Dr. Herrera reported massive electronic transfers from Whitmore accounts, desperate attempts to move money offshore before federal seizure orders could be executed. Captain Morales confirmed that Coast Guard vessels were moving to intercept Whitmore maritime ships that had suddenly changed course from their scheduled routes. But the most significant development came from Professor Petrov at Georgetown Law. "Elena." Her voice was tight with excitement through the secure connection. "Marcus's phone call from your kitchen triggered something we didn't expect. His panic communications went to numbers we've been monitoring as part of other federal corruption investigations." The implications were staggering. Marcus's network wasn't just involved in trafficking, they were connected to multiple criminal enterprises that had been infiltrating federal agencies for years. "We're not just taking down one trafficking operation," Professor Petrov continued. "We're unraveling systematic corruption that spans multiple agencies and criminal organizations." Sarah Martinez's voice joined the conversation from her position coordinating local law enforcement. "Elena Miami-Dade has been ordered to stand down from all operations involving federal agencies. Someone's trying to protect the corrupted officials by limiting local law enforcement access." But Judge Delgado had anticipated this response. Her authorization included provisions for international law enforcement coordination, specifically designed to circumvent corrupted federal channels. "Agent Rodriguez." Judge Delgado's voice cut through the tactical chatter. "We're escalating to Phase 2. International arrest warrants are being executed simultaneously across multiple countries. Canada has arrested 3 Whitmore maritime executives. Caribbean authorities are seizing resort properties, and European banks are freezing offshore accounts." From my position in the house where I'd lived unknowingly at the center of a criminal empire, I watched the systematic destruction of everything Marcus had built. But I also watched for signs that the network was preparing to eliminate witnesses, starting with me. The first indication came from Dr. Ruiz, who is monitoring the psychological state of trafficking victims under federal protection. "Elena, 3 of our protected witnesses have received messages threatening their families if they testify. Someone's still operating inside federal witness protection." The second warning came from my own surveillance equipment. Sarah had installed monitoring devices throughout our house, and they were picking up electronic signals that suggested someone was tracking my location in real time. "Elena." David's voice carried urgent concern. "We're seeing surveillance equipment that wasn't there this morning. Someone's been in your house." I moved carefully through rooms that had been my home for 5 years now, seeing them as a potential crime scene. Marcus's study showed signs of hasty document destruction papers scattered around a commercial shredder, hard drives missing from computers, safe open and empty. But in his panic, Marcus had made the same mistake that brought down most criminals. He'd tried to destroy evidence instead of simply disappearing. The scattered papers included fragments of communications that our forensics team could reconstruct, providing final proof of federal corruption at the highest levels. "Judge Delgado," I reported through my encrypted phone, "Marcus has attempted to destroy evidence, but he's left fragments that prove federal coordination with criminal operations. We have documented proof of treason." "Excellent. Agent Rodriguez, we're moving to extract you immediately. Intelligence suggests the Whitmore network is preparing for violent retaliation." As federal protection teams moved into position around our house, I realized that the careful investigation we'd conducted over the past weeks was about to explode into open warfare between law enforcement and a criminal network that had nothing left to lose. Marcus had spent 5 years thinking he'd neutralized the threat of a federal agent wife through manipulation and legal traps. Instead, he'd created the perfect inside witness to bring down systematic federal corruption. The pressure we'd been building was about to become an avalanche that would bury everyone involved in the Whitmore criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came from Dr. Carmen Ruiz's patient advocacy work. 24 hours after Marcus's panicked threats, and our kitchen victims, who had been too terrified to speak, began emerging from the shadows, their courage fortified by news reports of international law enforcement action against the Whitmore network. "Elena." Dr. Ruiz's voice carried barely contained excitement as she called from the secure facility where victims were being interviewed. "We have 17 people who've agreed to provide testimony. Not just about trafficking, about the federal officials who facilitated their exploitation. The first testimony session took place in the federal courthouse's secure witness facility, with international observers present to ensure victim protection beyond the reach of corrupted U.S. agencies. I sat behind one-way glass with Judge Delgado David and Professor Petrov, listening as Maria Santos translated for a young woman whose courage was reshaping our entire understanding of the Whitmore operation. "My name is Carmen Vela." The witness began, her voice steady despite the trauma she was recounting. "I was 19 when men came to my village in Colombia promising work at a resort in Barbados." Through Maria's translation, Carmen described a recruitment process that was sickeningly systematic: false employment contracts, document confiscation, and promises of legitimate work that became enslavement within hours of arriving at Whitmore properties. "But what we hadn't expected," Carmen continued, "was her testimony about the federal officials who facilitated the operation. The American officials who came to the resort, they weren't tourists. Carmen said, her voice growing stronger as she realized the importance of her testimony. They were government people. I saw their badges, their official papers. They would inspect our working conditions and tell the guards how to hide us better when other inspectors came. Judge Delgado leaned forward, her expression grim. Agent Rodriguez, this witness is describing federal officials actively participating in trafficking operations, not just enabling them through corruption. The second witness, a man named Roberto Morales, provided even more devastating testimony. Roberto had worked on Whitmore maritime vessels, and his account revealed the sophisticated coordination between criminal operations and federal agencies. The ships would change routes based on radio communications with people who spoke English and used government codes. Roberto testified, when Coast Guard ships were in the area, someone would radio our captain with new coordinates that kept us away from inspection zones. Through Dr. Ruiz's careful questioning, Roberto described a pattern of federal coordination that went far beyond passive corruption. Coast Guard officials were actively coordinating with trafficking operations, providing real-time intelligence that allowed criminal ships to avoid detection. Roberto, Dr. Ruiz asked gently, "Did you ever see the people who provided this information?" "Once," Roberto replied. A Coast Guard officer came aboard our ship in international waters. He wore a uniform, had official identification. He reviewed our cargo manifest and told the captain which shipping routes were safe from federal inspection. Professor Petrov was taking notes rapidly, her expertise in national security law helping her understand the legal implications of Roberto's testimony. "This isn't just corruption," she whispered to Judge Delgado. "This is active conspiracy between federal officials and international criminal organizations. We're looking at treason charges against military officers." The third day of testimony brought the most shocking revelation of all. A woman named Isabella Reyes, who had been trafficked through multiple Whitmore properties over 3 years, described something that made everyone in the secure facility fall silent. The American woman, the one married to the owner, Isabella said, she would visit the property sometimes. The guards would tell us she was important, that she worked for the American government and could have us arrested if we caused trouble. My blood turned to ice as I realized Isabella was describing me my unwitting visits to Whitmore properties during family vacations, my federal credentials being used to terrorize trafficking victims into submission. "Isabella, doctor," Ruiz asked carefully, "what did the guards tell you about this woman?" "They said she was a federal agent who investigated people like us, that she would send us to prison if we tried to escape or ask for help. They showed us pictures of her with government officials, said she was the one who made sure police never helped trafficking victims." I felt sick understanding that my own image and credentials had been weaponized against the very people I'd dedicated my career to protecting. Marcus hadn't just used my expertise to facilitate criminal operations. He'd used my identity to psychologically torture victims into compliance. Judge Delgado's voice was gentle but firm as she addressed me through the intercom. "Agent Rodriguez, you need to understand that these victims were deliberately terrorized using your identity. This is evidence of how sophisticated the psychological manipulation was." But the testimony that broke me completely came from a teenage girl named Luce, barely 18, who described being trafficked through Whitmore operations for 2 years. The worst part, Luce said, her voice barely above a whisper, was knowing that the American government knew about us and didn't care. The woman agent, they said she had seen us working and approved of our conditions. They said Americans thought people like us deserved to be slaves. Through her tears, Luce described the systematic psychological destruction that kept victims compliant, the deliberate cultivation of hopelessness, the careful construction of a reality where seeking help would only result in worse punishment. They made us believe that everyone, police, government, even our own families had abandoned us, that we were worth nothing except our labor. Dr. Ruiz's voice was steady as she guided Luce through her testimony, but I could see the impact on everyone in the room. This wasn't just about criminal enterprise, it was about the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable people using the authority of the United States government. As the testimony sessions continued over the following days, a pattern emerged that was more devastating than any of us had imagined. The Whitmore network hadn't just corrupted federal officials, they had weaponized federal authority itself, using the credibility of U.S. law enforcement to facilitate international human trafficking. Captain Morales provided the final piece of the puzzle when he testified about Coast Guard operations that had been compromised by the very officials who should have been preventing trafficking. For 3 years, I documented cases where our interdiction operations were systematically sabotaged. Captain Morales testified before the congressional committee that had been convened in emergency session. Ships we were tracking would disappear from radar. Boarding operations would be canceled due to national security concerns. Evidence we collected would disappear from federal databases. Captain Morales, the committee chair asked, "Are you testifying that federal officials actively facilitated human trafficking operations?" "Yes, sir. And I'm testifying that they used national security classifications to prevent investigation of their crimes." By the end of the testimony wave, we had documented accounts from 23 victims and 7 federal witnesses, painting a picture of systematic corruption that spanned multiple agencies and criminal organizations. But we'd also documented something else, the incredible courage of people who had been systematically dehumanized, who found the strength to speak truth to power, even when they had every reason to believe the system would punish them for it. Elena Dar Ruiz said as we reviewed the final testimony transcripts. "These people trusted us with their stories because they believe justice is possible. We can't let them down." The victim testimony had transformed our investigation from a case about individual corruption to documentation of systematic crimes against humanity, facilitated by the very government agencies sworn to prevent them. Now it was time to ensure that their courage resulted in justice. The first attempt on my life came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days after the victim testimony had been transmitted to international human rights organizations. I woke to the sound of glass breaking in our Coral Gables kitchen, the same room where Marcus had threatened my family just weeks before. The federal protection detail that Judge Delgado had assigned responded within seconds, but the message was clear. The Whitmore Network was prepared to eliminate witnesses, rather than face the consequences of international prosecution. "Elena, get down." Agent Lisa Park's voice cut through the darkness as she coordinated the protection team's response. "We have multiple intruders armed and moving toward your location." I rolled from the bed to the floor, my federal training taking over as gunfire erupted from the first floor. The protection detail had been anticipating this escalation, but the sophistication of the attack suggested professional assassins rather than common criminals. Through my encrypted earpiece, I heard David coordinating from the federal command center they'd established at an undisclosed location. "Elena, the attackers are using federal law enforcement equipment, night vision communication gear, tactical weapons. Someone with high-level access is supplying them." The irony was devastating. Federal equipment was being used to murder a federal agent who was investigating federal corruption, but it was also evidence, more proof of how deeply the corruption had penetrated law enforcement agencies. The gunfight lasted 17 minutes, ending when local Miami-Dade SWAT units arrived to support the federal protection detail. 2 attackers were killed, 3 escaped, and Agent Park was wounded but stable. But the assassination attempt had accomplished something the Whitmore Network hadn't intended. It had triggered emergency protocols that elevated our investigation to the highest levels of international law enforcement. "Agent Rodriguez." Judge Delgado's voice was grim as she briefed me from the secure location where I'd been evacuated. "The attack on federal agents investigating international trafficking has been designated as terrorism. This is now a matter of national security." The escalation brought new resources, but also new dangers. Within hours of the assassination attempt, we received intelligence that the Whitmore Network was planning to eliminate not just me, but every witness who had provided testimony. Dr. Ruiz called from the secure facility where trafficking victims were being protected. "Elena, we've intercepted communications planning attacks on our witness protection locations. They're not just trying to silence you, they're planning to murder every victim who testified." The systematic nature of the planned violence revealed the true scope of what we were fighting. This wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was an organization with the resources and connections to wage war against federal law enforcement. Sarah Martinez provided the intelligence that explained how the Whitmore Network could coordinate such sophisticated violence. "Elena, we've identified the source of their tactical capabilities. 3 former federal agents, 2 ex-military officers, and a retired CIA operative are all on Whitmore payroll. They're not just corrupting current officials, they're recruiting former government personnel to conduct operations against current law enforcement." The names on Sarah's list read like a roster of decorated law enforcement and military careers, people who had taken oaths to protect and serve, now using their training to facilitate international trafficking and murder federal agents. Professor Petrov's analysis of the legal implications was chilling. Elena, what we're documenting goes beyond corruption into the realm of domestic terrorism. Former federal officials are using government training to conduct operations against the United States government. But the most disturbing intelligence came from Captain Morales, whose Coast Guard contacts had uncovered the scope of the planned violence. Agent Rodriguez, they're not planning isolated attacks. Intelligence suggests coordinated strikes against federal facilities, witness protection locations, and international law enforcement offices. They're planning to eliminate the entire investigation through systematic violence. The threat was so comprehensive that it triggered protocols I'd never seen implemented. International law enforcement agencies began coordinating protection for their personnel. Congressional leaders were briefed on threats against federal agents investigating government corruption. European allies offered to provide additional security for witnesses under international protection. The second escalation came when my parents were targeted directly. Elena. Carlos called, his voice shaking with something I'd never heard from my police detective brother, fear. Men broke into Mommy and Papi's house. Professional armed, using equipment I've only seen in federal raids. My parents had been evacuated to federal protection, but the attack on elderly immigrants who had never committed a crime illustrated the network's willingness to target innocent family members. They left a message. Carlos continued, "Stop the investigation or watch your family die one by one." The threat against my parents triggered something in me that went beyond professional duty. These criminals had weaponized federal authority to traffic human beings, terrorize victims, and corrupt law enforcement. Now they were threatening to murder my family to protect their criminal empire. "David," I said through the encrypted connection, "it's time to end this." "Elena, we're still gathering evidence for—" "No more evidence gathering. We have enough to prosecute. We have victim testimony, financial documentation, proof of federal corruption, and now evidence of domestic terrorism. It's time to bring them all down." Judge Delgado's voice cut through our planning discussion. "Agent Rodriguez, are you requesting authorization for immediate takedown operations?" "Yes, Your Honor. They've escalated to violence against federal agents and witnesses. We need to respond with overwhelming force before they can eliminate more evidence or harm more people." The authorization came within hours, but it brought sobering intelligence about the scope of what we were attempting. "Elena." Professor Petrov warned, "We're not just taking down a criminal network. We're taking down federal officials, military personnel, and CIA operatives who have the training and resources to fight back." Captain Morales added his perspective from the maritime enforcement side. "The Whitmore Network has been preparing for this possibility. They have weapons safe houses and communication systems that rival federal capabilities." But Dr. Herrera provided the intelligence that convinced me we had no choice but to act immediately. Elena, financial analysis shows they're liquidating everything. Offshore accounts are being emptied, assets are being transferred to untraceable entities. If we don't act within 48 hours, they'll disappear completely and resurface somewhere else with new identities. The final decision came when Dr. Ruiz called with devastating news. Elena, one of our witnesses, was murdered. Isabella Reyes, the woman who testified about being shown your photo, they found her in her protection facility. Someone with federal access got to her. Isabella, who had survived 3 years of trafficking and found the courage to testify against her tormentors, had been murdered by the very system that promised to protect her. "That's it," I said, my voice carrying a finality that surprised everyone on the secure connection. "We're done waiting. We're done gathering evidence. We're done letting them murder people while we build legal cases." Judge Delgado's authorization was swift and comprehensive. "Agent Rodriguez, you have authorization for coordinated takedown operations. Federal, international, and military resources are at your disposal." As tactical teams prepared for simultaneous raids across multiple states and countries, I thought about Isabella Reyes, about the trafficking victims who had trusted us with their stories about my parents who had immigrated with nothing and built honest lives that were now threatened by criminals who had corrupted the very system meant to protect them. The Whitmore Network had chosen violence. Now they would learn what happened when they threatened a federal agent who had dedicated her life to justice. The operation began at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, coordinated across 12 time zones, with a precision that reflected months of international law enforcement planning. From the Federal Command Center in an undisclosed location, I watched multiple screens displaying simultaneous raids on Whitmore properties, spanning from Miami to the Cayman Islands. Alpha Team Terminal 7 secured. Captain Morales' voice crackled through the communication system as Coast Guard and federal agents stormed the Port Miami facility that had been the hub of trafficking operations. Multiple containers with concealed compartments documentation of systematic human trafficking. On the screen displaying the port operation, I watched federal agents uncovering the infrastructure that had facilitated years of human trafficking, hidden compartments in shipping containers, modified cargo holds designed to transport people in inhumane conditions, and communication equipment that had coordinated with corrupted federal officials. Bravo Team Star Island Mansion secured. Sarah Martinez reported from the operation targeting Marcus's family estate. Massive document destruction in progress when we arrived, but we've secured financial records and communication devices. The Star Island raid was particularly satisfying to watch. Victoria Whitmore, the woman who had dismissed me as a temporary addition to their family, was being escorted from her mansion in handcuffs, while federal agents cataloged evidence of her coordination with international criminal organizations. But the most crucial operation was taking place in international waters, where the Caribbean Star, the vessel I'd first identified through customs irregularities, was being intercepted by a joint Coast Guard and Royal Canadian Navy operation. Echo Team vessel secured, came the report from the maritime operation. 17 trafficking victims recovered alive. Extensive documentation of federal coordination with criminal operations at their Ruiz was coordinating the victim recovery operations, ensuring that people who had been treated as cargo received immediate medical attention and psychological support. Elena, she reported through the secure connection. The victims we're recovering are confirming everything we documented in testimony. Federal officials were not just enabling trafficking, they were actively managing operations. As the coordinated raids continued, the scope of evidence being recovered exceeded our most optimistic projections. Financial records documenting billions in laundered money communication logs, proving federal coordination with criminal organizations, and physical evidence of systematic human trafficking. Professor Petrov was coordinating the legal aspects of the takedown, ensuring that evidence collected across multiple jurisdictions would be admissible in federal court. Elena, we're documenting crimes that span federal, international, and military law. The evidence we're recovering will support prosecutions for treason, human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy against the United States government. But the most significant development came when federal agents raided the offices of corrupted officials within government agencies themselves. Charlie Team Department of Homeland Security offices secured. Agent Park reported from the operation targeting corrupted immigration officials. Extensive evidence of coordination with trafficking operations, including real-time intelligence sharing with criminal organizations. The raids on federal facilities were unprecedented. Active federal agents arresting their own colleagues for participating in international trafficking operations. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the coordination had been so systematic that entire departmental divisions were implicated. David was coordinating the evidence analysis from the Federal Command Center, where forensic accountants were processing financial records in real time. Elena, the financial evidence is staggering. We're documenting federal contracts worth hundreds of millions that were structured to facilitate money laundering. Government agencies were literally paying criminal organizations to conduct trafficking operations. As the takedown operations progressed, we began to understand the true scope of the Whitmore Network's federal penetration. Corrupted officials in Immigration, Coast Guard, Port Authority, Treasury, and even congressional staff had been systematically facilitating international crime while using federal resources to eliminate opposition. The breakthrough moment came when federal agents arrested Marcus himself at a private airfield where he was attempting to flee to a non-extradition country. Delta Team primary target secured, came the report that sent satisfaction through the command center. Marcus Whitmore in custody, private aircraft loaded with documentation and financial instruments. Watching Marcus being placed in federal custody. The man who had manipulated me for 5 years, who had used my expertise to perfect criminal operations, who had threatened my family to protect his empire, provided a sense of closure that no amount of evidence could have delivered. But the operation wasn't complete until we'd addressed the corrupted federal officials who had made the Whitmore Network possible. Foxtrot Team Coast Guard Intelligence Division secured, Captain Morales reported grimly. Multiple arrests of active duty personnel involved in trafficking coordination. The arrests of federal law enforcement officials were the most difficult aspect of the operation. These were people who had taken oaths to protect and serve, who had been entrusted with federal authority, and who had betrayed that trust to facilitate international crime. Judge Delgado's voice carried the weight of the moment as she addressed the command center. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've accomplished today represents one of the largest corruption takedowns in federal law enforcement history. As the operation concluded, the evidence tallies were staggering: 47 arrests across 6 countries, $2.3 billion in assets, seized 17 federal officials charged with treason and conspiracy, and most importantly, 34 trafficking victims recovered alive. Dr. Herrera provided the financial analysis that explained the scope of what we'd dismantled. Elena, the Whitmore network, was processing over $800 million annually in criminal proceeds through federal contract systems. They had created a parallel government infrastructure designed to facilitate international crime. But the most significant aspect of the takedown was what it revealed about the systematic nature of federal corruption. Professor Petrov's legal analysis was sobering. Elena, what we've documented isn't just individual corruption, it's systematic compromise of federal agencies by international criminal organizations. This will require fundamental reform of how federal law enforcement operates. Sarah Martinez, who had coordinated the local law enforcement aspects of the operation, provided perspective on the broader implications. Elena, this takedown is going to send shockwaves through every federal agency. The evidence we've gathered will trigger investigations that last for years, congressional hearings that reshape federal law enforcement and international cooperation agreements that prevent this level of corruption from recurring. As I watched the final arrest reports coming in, I realized that what had begun as an investigation into my husband's betrayal had evolved into the largest federal corruption case in decades. The personal had become political, the individual had become institutional. And the wife who had been deemed temporary had become the agent who brought down systematic government corruption. Captain Morales provided the final report that brought our coordinated takedown to a close. Elena, all operations successful. No casualties among law enforcement or recovered victims. Complete dismantling of the Whitmore criminal network. But even as we celebrated the success of the operation, I knew that the real work was just beginning. Prosecuting the cases we'd built, protecting the victims we'd recovered, and reforming the federal systems that had been compromised would take years of continued effort. Marcus Whitmore had married a federal agent thinking he'd gained access to expertise that would protect his criminal empire. Instead, he'd created the perfect inside witness to bring down systematic corruption within the federal government itself. The coordinated takedown was complete, but justice was just beginning. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse witness chair facing the man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years. Marcus Whitmore, no longer the confident heir to a criminal empire, wore an orange jumpsuit, and the haunted expression of someone who'd finally understood the consequences of his choices. Agent Rodriguez. The federal prosecutor began, "Please describe for the jury how the defendant used your federal credentials to facilitate international trafficking operations." After over 3 days of testimony, I walked the jury through 5 years of systematic manipulation. How Marcus had weaponized my love, exploited my expertise, and corrupted my federal access to perfect a criminal empire that had destroyed countless lives. The evidence we'd compiled was overwhelming. Financial records showing billions in laundered money, victim testimony, documenting systematic trafficking, and recorded conversations proving federal corruption at the highest levels. But the most powerful moment came when trafficking victims testified about their experiences with Dr. Ruiz, providing support, and Maria Santos translating for those who spoke limited English. Carmen Vela, the young woman whose initial testimony had helped break open the case, faced Marcus directly as she described her trafficking experience. "He destroyed my life for profit," she said, her voice steady despite the trauma she was recounting. "But he also taught me that justice is possible when good people refuse to be silent." The federal trial lasted 8 weeks with testimony from 76 witnesses and evidence that filled 2 entire courtrooms. When the verdict was read guilty on all 43 counts, including treason, human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy, Marcus's complete collapse was visible to everyone present. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Victoria Whitmore's trial followed immediately, and her conviction on 37 counts resulted in a sentence of 60 years in federal prison. The woman who had planned my disposal as a temporary wife would spend the rest of her life experiencing the permanence of federal incarceration. But the most satisfying trial was that of the corrupted federal officials who had enabled the Whitmore network. Agent Thomas Bradley, the Coast Guard officer who had provided real-time intelligence to trafficking operations, received 40 years for treason. His testimony during sentencing revealed the scope of federal corruption that had facilitated international crime. "I betrayed everything I swore to protect," Bradley admitted to the court. Agent Rodriguez's investigation exposed corruption that would have continued destroying lives if she hadn't had the courage to act. The congressional hearings that followed the trials were unprecedented in their scope and impact. Over 6 months, congressional committees examined how federal agencies had been systematically compromised by international criminal organizations. My testimony before Congress focused on the institutional reforms needed to prevent similar corruption. Senators, what we discovered wasn't just individual misconduct. It was systematic compromise of federal agencies that facilitated international crime. Reform requires fundamental changes to oversight, accountability, and interagency coordination. The legislative response was swift and comprehensive. The Federal Law Enforcement Integrity Act, dubbed the Rodriguez Act, by media coverage, implemented new oversight mechanisms, whistleblower protections, and international cooperation protocols designed to prevent federal corruption. But the most meaningful recognition came from the victims whose courage had made justice possible. At the federal courthouse ceremony, recognizing the investigation, Carmen Vela presented me with a letter, signed by 34 trafficking survivors. "Agent Rodriguez," she read aloud, "you taught us that temporary suffering can become permanent strength when we refuse to accept injustice. Thank you for proving that one person's courage can change everything." The financial impact of our investigation was staggering. $2. $3 billion in criminal assets were seized and redistributed to victim compensation funds, law enforcement agencies, and anti-trafficking organizations. The Whitmore empire, built on human suffering, was transformed into resources for healing and prevention. Dr. Herrera's forensic analysis had revealed financial connections that led to additional investigations across 12 countries. The Whitmore takedown triggered a cascade of international prosecutions that dismantled trafficking networks throughout the Caribbean and South America. "Elena," she told me at the 1-year anniversary of the operation, "your investigation has prevented more trafficking operations than any single law enforcement action in decades. The networks we've dismantled were responsible for trafficking over 2,000 people annually." But the personal resolution was equally important. My parents, who had been terrorized by Marcus's network, attended the final sentencing hearing and watched their daughter receive recognition for exposing government corruption. "Mija," my father said afterward, his voice thick with emotion, "you made something beautiful from something terrible. You turned betrayal into justice." Carlos, my brother, who had been manipulated into working against me, had provided crucial testimony that helped convict several corrupted officials. His experience with federal manipulation had transformed him into an advocate for law enforcement reform. "Elena," he said at our family celebration dinner, "I'm sorry I doubted you, but I'm proud of who you became when it mattered most." The professional recognition was gratifying, but the personal validation was transformative. The woman who had been deemed temporary by Marcus's family had become permanently recognized as one of the most effective federal agents in the Bureau's history. Judge Delgado provided the perspective that helped me understand the broader significance of what we'd accomplished. "Agent Rodriguez," she said at the federal courthouse ceremony, "your investigation didn't just bring criminals to justice, it restored integrity to federal law enforcement. You proved that individual courage can triumph over systematic corruption." As I accepted the Federal Bureau of Investigation's highest honor for distinguished service, I thought about the moment that started everything overhearing Marcus and Victoria planning my replacement at a charity auction. They had seen me as temporary, disposable someone whose value could be measured and discarded when more suitable options appeared. Instead, I had become the agent who brought down the largest federal corruption scandal in decades, who helped rescue dozens of trafficking victims, and who proved that underestimating someone's permanence could be a fatal mistake. Marcus Whitmore had married a federal agent thinking he'd gained an asset to exploit. He had actually married the woman who would ensure his permanent destruction. Justice had been served completely and finally. 2 years after the final convictions, I stood before a packed auditorium at the FBI National Academy, addressing a new class of federal agents who would carry forward the lessons learned from the Whitmore investigation. When I first joined the Bureau, I began, I believed that federal agents were immune to the corruption we investigated in others. I learned that immunity from corruption requires constant vigilance, institutional accountability, and the courage to investigate uncomfortable truths. In the audience, I saw faces that reminded me of my younger self, idealistic, dedicated, ready to fight for justice. But I also saw the wisdom that comes from understanding how sophisticated criminal enterprises operate, how they exploit personal relationships and institutional weaknesses. The most important lesson from the Whitmore case is this: criminals don't just corrupt institutions, they corrupt the people within those institutions. They target our personal relationships, our family connections, our professional ambitions. They make corruption feel like love, like loyalty, like patriotism. After my lecture, I returned to my office in the newly created Federal Corruption Task Force, the permanent unit established in response to our investigation. The walls displayed commendations from international law enforcement agencies, letters from trafficking survivors, and photographs from congressional ceremonies recognizing the institutional reforms we'd achieved. But the most meaningful item on my desk was a simple framed photograph of my parents at their naturalization ceremony 25 years ago, holding the American flag with the pride of people who believed in the promise of justice and opportunity. They had sacrificed everything to give their daughter the chance to serve something greater than herself. That sacrifice had created the agent who brought down systematic federal corruption and saved dozens of lives. Dr. Ruiz called to update me on the long-term recovery of trafficking survivors. Elena, 32 of the 34 victims we recovered have successfully integrated into new lives. They're working, studying, building families. Your investigation didn't just bring their traffickers to justice, it gave them back their futures. Sarah Martinez had been promoted to head the Miami-Dade Anti-Corruption Unit, applying lessons from our investigation to prevent local law enforcement corruption. Elena, we've identified and stopped 3 potential corruption schemes using techniques we developed during the Whitmore case. Your work keeps producing results. David, my partner throughout the investigation, had been selected to head the Federal Bureau's new Institutional Integrity Division. Elena, every month we receive tips from federal agents who recognize corruption patterns because of training based on your case. You've institutionalized vigilance against corruption. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me from betrayed wife to federal corruption specialist. Marcus had intended to use my temporary status in his life to facilitate permanent criminal operations. Instead, I had become permanently dedicated to preventing the kind of systematic corruption that had enabled his crimes. The woman Marcus had planned to discard had become the agent who ensured that federal law enforcement would never again be so vulnerable to criminal exploitation. My transformation was complete, but my work was permanent, and I had never been more certain that I belonged exactly where I was. From the Ball Harbor Club terrace, where Elena first heard the truth, to the federal courthouse where Marcus received life imprisonment, this story proves that the most dangerous person to cross is someone whose expertise you've been exploiting. Elena turned Marcus's own legal trap against him, used her FBI skills to expose systematic federal corruption, and transformed from a temporary wife into the agent who brought down a $2 billion criminal empire.